welcome to another episode of Bridge the Channel, coming to you from London. I've had prepared a long, winding introduction about how spring is coming and everything is becoming more optimistic after two pretty grim, dark months here. Actually, it's not as sunny as we hoped it would be today, which is a bit of a nice analogy about where the state of international geopolitics is and the stuff that we'll be talking about. Perhaps in the previous episodes you remember that a lot of stuff were seen as a bit upbeat. We're talking about, for example, prospects of resolving the Northern Ireland issue, but things are still a bit more complicated. Plus, of course, we have increasing new problems and tensions, for example, with the regards of the EU's relationship with China, what that means also as a reflection of that for the transatlantic relationship. Lots of stuff to discuss about the triangle between Europe, North America, the UK, China. Loads of things to discuss moving forward into a very interesting spring and perhaps also a very interesting summer. So let's go see what we have for you in this month's episode. So about the Northern Ireland problem, you may remember from our previous episodes where I had predicted, although it was much of a prediction, it was pretty much pre-announced, that Joe Biden would visit Northern Ireland on the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, and that was a reason for the UK government to push through a resolution of the Northern Ireland problem. Now, the visit did indeed take place around a week before the time that we're recording this, but it really was a bit anticlimactic from the UK side. I would actually say even a bit problematic from the UK side. And it also was very celebratory on the Irish side, which is a bit interesting in its own right about concerning Joe Biden's political strategy. Now, on the UK side, the main problem is that the job was not completely done by the time Biden visited. The job was not completely done because there's still no government in Northern Ireland. The hope was that the resolution of the Northern Ireland problem with the Windsor Framework will also lead all political parties in Northern Ireland to recreate the government in Northern Ireland. That hasn't been the case, and as a result, when Joe Biden visited, there was still unfinished business, which was reflected quite badly on the UK. If I'm allowed to say this, I actually think that the Joe Biden visit in Northern Ireland was slightly of a PR disaster for the US president in the UK. The perception was that he's actually way too pro-Irish, pro-Republican, however you want to call the sides in Northern Ireland. It was definitely seen that the UK government did not take as much as it would like from that visit, and as a result also the presence of Joe Biden in Northern Ireland was not seen in a very positive light here in the UK. Now, when he went to the south of the border, to the Republic of Ireland, of course it was a completely different story. It was generally quite unclear what he was trying to achieve with his visits, apart perhaps revisiting his roots. There was a lot of celebration about his Irish identity, and of course when it comes to Irish identity in American politics, there's only one explanation, or basically there's one main explanation: politics. It's good for all American politicians of Irish descent to hype up their Irishness ahead of elections, and that was pretty much what Joe Biden was getting at. So an interesting visit from the perspective of US domestic politics and US-Irish relations, but something that really was not quite what Rishi Sunak had expected, a bit deflating after what he thought was his big success of negotiating the Windsor Framework. Now, speaking of visits whose exact meaning is not quite clear, after the Joe Biden visit in Northern Ireland, how about the visit by 4 or 5, I've lost count by now, European officials to Beijing over the last couple of weeks? We've had the leaders of Spain and France going to Beijing, Ursula von der Leyen going to Beijing, the foreign minister of Germany, and almost the high representative of the EU for foreign affairs, who cancelled his visit at the last moment because of COVID. Now, the sum aggregate result of those visits wasn't really particularly great for the EU. It reflected again the big divergence of European opinion about how to do the relationship with China. Of course, the person who again stole the limelight was President of France, Macron, with his highly controversial comments about what the EU is trying to get out of China, and particularly how that reflects on the relationship between the EU and the US. The general assessment has been that the EU is suffering from a clear strategic position on the issue of China, not least because other actors such as Ursula von der Leyen and Annalena Baerbock conveyed completely different messages to Beijing about Taiwan, about China's relationship with the international order and the rest of it. Now, I have a slightly less negative assessment, not only of Emmanuel Macron's comments on China, but generally about the EU strategy and position towards China. We shouldn't pretend that everyone in the world knows how to deal with China. In this country, the UK, which is supposedly one of the staunchest supporters of the American position on China and a very kind of big supporter of human rights and a more kind of principled approach towards China, this country as well is always prevaricating between a more principled strategic position on the one hand and also trying to maintain economic links with China on the other. Sometimes even the US itself is prevaricating. We shouldn't pretend that the position of the American security establishment and American business, for example, is all in the same on China. So I think we need to take it a bit easier on the EU, because the EU, just like everybody else in the world, is trying to maximize its benefits from its relationship with China. Yes, the EU is very principled on some issues. Of course, the EU is taking the problem of Taiwan quite seriously, but at the same time, it's also trying to gain as much as it can out of the Chinese relationship, especially at a moment of big economic volatility during the war in Ukraine. And I'm not saying, of course, that this perception of cacophony is not problematic for EU foreign policy on China, but perhaps we should also be a bit more patient with what the Europeans are trying to achieve there. Ultimately, maintaining some connections with Beijing may not be a bad idea moving forward and trying to manage international problems. So we discussed about Northern Ireland before. Let's just say something else about Brexit, if you remember that. And something that happens right now in British politics, which is pretty interesting from a symbolic perspective, actually, about what Brexit ultimately means, and this kind of idea that Brexit will be the triumph of sovereignty. You may remember that one of the plans of the Boris Johnson government was to introduce a law in the British Parliament that would basically cancel all EU-related or EU-inspired laws in the British legal order. Most commentators thought that was completely crazy, because so many aspects of the British legal order, so many everyday rules that govern British political and economic life are related to the EU, of course. The Sunak government made it clear from the beginning that it was very enthusiastic about it. It was trying to find ways to actually keep this law from pressing ahead, despite the insistence of the Brexit wing of the Conservative Party. Now, in recent days, it's finally clear that this law is not finding its way into a vote into the British Parliament. It's basically allowed to die a slow death in committees between the two houses. To my mind, it's actually very symbolic about Brexit, which essentially is not resulting in a big bang of sovereignty, but it is dying a slow, quiet, unceremonious death. It kind of shows the pragmatism of the Sunak government in understanding that still in many ways the UK will be entangled with the EU, and that breaking away from that relationship will have to proceed very, very slowly. The UK is realizing now slowly the impact of Brexit with regards to product shortages, staff shortages, queues at Dover, and all the rest of it. So, of course, the government is actually trying to minimize the impact as much as possible, instead of actually trying to make the most of Brexit, as still the supporters of Brexit claim. So, to my mind, this is actually a very nice symbolic way of showing what Brexit has become in Britain, something many people think about, but they don't really want to talk much about. So that was another episode of Bridge the Channel, an episode of anticipation for spring and for better days and for sun. I'm not sure when that is coming, especially here in the UK. Along many other issues, there's big domestic political developments coming up here. We have local elections coming up, a new wave of strikes. So some people already call it the spring or even the summer of discontent, and of course all other political developments that we have discussed on EU-China relations, on transatlantic relations, on domestic politics in the United States, which are also heating up, of course. We're going to be here to try to put all the pieces of the puzzle together to give you a nice, big, comprehensive picture of international geopolitics, particularly in the transatlantic area. Until next time, take care.